Nelson is a historian and writer based in Boston with a BA from Harvard and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Iowa. She is the author of 4 books, including The Three-Cornered War, which was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in history. Dr. Nelson writes about the Civil War, the U.S. West, and the American culture for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, where she gets her messages on a signal feed, Smithsonian Magazine, Slate, and Time. She is the 2024-25 Rogers Distinguished Fellow in 19th Century American History at the Huntington Library in San Marino for just a few more weeks. And we are very pleased to have her with us tonight. So please give her a warm welcome.
Thanks for having me here at your awesome round table. I'm just going to give you a kind of introduction to the book itself, how it came about, a couple of the major kind of figures in the book, along with some photographs and some maps and some, discussion of some very cool sources I found in the archives and how I used them. So, without any further ado, so one of the major questions is always, where do books come from, right? And for me, a book always grows out of the book that I am writing currently. So the book before Three-Cornered War was Ruined Nation, which was my first foray into Civil War history. It's a book about different forms of destruction in the American Civil War, cities, houses, forests, and bodies. And while I was researching this book and doing sort of general Civil War history and teaching courses in my previous life as a professor, teaching courses in American Civil War history, I came across these battles in New Mexico, Valverde and Apache Canyon and Glorieta Pass, and I was like, wait a minute, what? Because I grew up in Colorado, and New Mexico's just down the way, and I had no idea that there were any battles in the desert Southwest, and I also didn't know that Colorado soldiers fought in those battles. So, as a historian, and I'm sure you guys also understand this as Civil War enthusiasts, whenever you find out something that you hadn't known before, you immediately want to know, first of all about it, and then why you didn't know. Why has this been erased? Why do we never talk about the Southwest and, to some extent, California, parts of West Texas, in the Civil War narrative usually? So I set out to kind of answer that question, and also these additional questions. Why did the Far West, I call it the Far West, by the way, because one of the things that happened, because military historians up until quite recently have focused mostly on the Eastern Theater, that separate country of Virginia, which hogs pretty much all of the attention. The Trans-Mississippi has somehow become the West, when we all know that's not the real West, right? So I have taken to calling this theater of the war either the Far West or sometimes the real West. So why did the Far West or the Southwest or the real West become a theater of the Civil War? And then why was it important? A lot of military historians kind of poo-poo it and say, oh, it was too marginal, like nobody really cares. But the book argues that it actually was quite important to the course of the Civil War and to the history of the West itself. And then what kinds of lessons can we learn from looking at this theater that we might not learn from looking at Virginia or the Trans-Mississippi West? So one of the first questions, sort of why, how did the Far West become this theater of the war? In the spring of 1861, why was anyone even thinking of going west? And this is the thing that really intrigued me when I first started thinking about this topic. We spend so much time when we talk about the coming of the Civil War on the West, right? We talk about the Mexican-American War and all its land cessions. We talk about the expansion of slavery into those newly acquired territories. We talk about the Transcontinental Railroad and the big fights happening between Jefferson Davis and his northern compatriots on where that railroad was going to go. And then somehow, Civil War historians sort of contend that once the guns fire on Fort Sumter, nobody cares about the West anymore. And I'm like, that can't be true, right? And one of the reasons we know that's not true is that the Confederates invaded New Mexico territory in the summer and fall of 1861. And you can see from this map, New Mexico looks slightly different today than it did back in the day when New Mexico territory really encompassed all of what we now know of as Arizona and New Mexico, right? So how did it come to be that Northerners and Southerners are sort of still caring about the West? Well, the bulk of the fighting is going on in the East. Well, there are three reasons. One, gold, right? Wars cost money. And the Sierra Nevadas and the Rocky Mountains have had gold rushes in the last 10 years. Lots of gold in those hills, very helpful for paying for the war and for stabilizing currency, right? So that's one reason. Second reason, Pacific ports. This is especially important for the Confederacy because already they knew there was going to be a blockade of all of their ports on the Atlantic coast and also the Gulf Coast. And so they thought, oh, look at those nice deep water ports. San Diego, Los Angeles, possibly even San Francisco. And then maybe even the Gulf of California, right? If they could persuade Mexico to cross that little bit of land just south of the California-New Mexico border, then maybe they could ship out their cotton and ship in supplies that way also, right? So two very important kind of logistical elements of the war itself. The third reason is a little bit more abstract, which has to do with both the North and the South's kind of vision of the future, right? What was the United States going to be like after the war? Northerners thought the West is going to be a land of freedom. Southerners think the West is going to be part of an empire of slavery. That if they can march an army from the very western point of Texas at El Paso, cross that little corridor in southern New Mexico, get to California, and take that, then they've got a coast-to-coast empire. And they might be able to persuade Mexico to establish diplomatic relations, they might be able to convince Europe, and they would be perhaps respected as a full-on nation and maybe kind of start to also work on that plan that the Knights of the Golden Circle had kind of cooked up to start expanding southward also into Mexico and into the Caribbean once they dispatched with the United States, right? So these are all the reasons for going west, and in fact the battles did occur, and they occurred in 4 different and very interesting phases. So, phase 1, the Confederate invasion. So this is the kind of, the path of it was this yellow line that I have here on the map. This began in July of 1861 with a force of 350 cavalry. These were the men that were left from the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles, which were led by John Baylor, who was a Texan, a rancher, slave owner, a pretty die-hard Confederate. And he had been tasked with marching along this yellow line, which was the San Antonio-El Paso Road, which is about 650 miles long. And he was tasked with taking over the federal forts along that road and garrisoning his men along the way. And then his orders were to stop in El Paso, kind of just south of this star where Mesilla and Fort Fillmore are, and to wait. Well, this is John Baylor. For those of you who are not familiar with him, he is of the Baylor family of Baylor University. It was not named after him, but after his uncle. The Baylor family was one of the kind of early Texas, Republic of Texas patriotic families. And Baylor had a lot of ambition. He also was extremely impatient and very paranoid. And so, he took his 300 men, he's sitting in El Paso, he's hearing that the U.S. forces under ERS Canby are kind of coalescing along the Rio Grande, And he kind of freaks out a little bit, and he takes his guys across the border, and he invades New Mexico territory in late July of 1861. He takes the town of Mesilla, which is a pro-Confederate stronghold, and he chases down the 400 soldiers of Federal Fort Fillmore, which is the southernmost federal fort in New Mexico territory, and forces them to surrender. This is one of the first surrenders in the American Civil Wars in New Mexico. And it's important to note that Baylor did this without orders. He had no permission from anyone, and this is one of the lessons that we learn that's really super interesting about the Far Western Theater, is a lot of these guys on both sides just did whatever they wanted. Now, why is that? Because their headquarters were more than 1,000 miles away. They had no trains, they had no telegraph wires. To get orders, they would have to send a note. It would take at least 2 weeks, and then they had to get it back for 2 weeks. It's going to take a month, right? So if you're an impetuous, impatient commander, and you have a vision, you're just going to do what you want, and then explain it later, right? This happened all the time. But Baylor was successful, right? Here we have the results of his successful invasion, because after he forced the surrender of those federal troops, he came back to Mesilla, he sat down, and he created the Confederate Territory of Arizona. So this is your exciting, like, as we were doing trivia questions before, what is the only territory that came into the Confederacy during the American Civil War? Arizona. And what did it look like? It was this little pink sliver there along the south. So the southern part of Arizona and New Mexico became the Confederate Territory of Arizona and was actually accepted into the Confederacy then in February of 1862. So this is one of the only maps that we have of this. This is an English firm that shows that at this point, very early in the war, the Confederacy is extending to the Colorado River. It's extending to the California border, which is just really wild to think about, right? So Baylor's sitting there, he's feeling good, he's writing to his family like, look what I did. I created a whole territory, which again, not really allowed to do, right? It's like not part of his purview or his power. But he was the vanguard. Coming up behind him was Henry Hopkins Sibley, who was a career military man. He'd been posted in Taos before the war began, and he resigned his commission. He's one of these guys who resigned and then went to Richmond, and he pitched Jefferson Davis this idea. He was like, what if I recruit an army of Texans? They'll bring their own kit, they all have horses anyway, they all have weapons, they'll bring it all. We will gather up, you know, a herd of cattle, but otherwise we'll subsist ourselves on the road by raiding ranches along the way, like in Texas, but particularly in New Mexico. And the goal was to take the federal forts in New Mexico, take all of their arms, all of their food, all of their fodder for the animals, and then march to California. Because again, California, the big prize, right? Jefferson Davis is like, this is great. I don't have to provide any soldiers for you. I don't have to provide any money. You're just going to go do this by yourself. This is amazing. So he said, okay, go do that with my blessing. Here are your orders. So Sibley started putting his army together in San Antonio. Unfortunately, Sibley, who was in fact the inventor of the Sibley tent and the Sibley stove, but couldn't get his act together to actually apply for the patents for either of those two things, so made no money on either of those inventions. He was very bad at paperwork. And when you were creating an army of 3,000 men, you kind of need to be good at paperwork, right? So it took him forever. He had all these grandiose ideas, and so all of these men he recruited are just sitting in San Antonio from July until basically late October, November of 1861. So he's delayed. But he thinks, that's fine. I have all these potential allies in the West. I have Anglo merchants and miners all over the West, many of them from the South. Now this was actually a pretty legit anticipation. There were Confederate-leaning miners in a lot of towns all over the West. There were a lot of fights at flagpoles, including in Taos, where Kit Carson had to get involved and get the Southerners to bring down the flag and put the U.S. flag back up. And in fact, I think Breckenridge, was mentioned earlier. If any of you have ever been skiing in Breckenridge, Colorado, that town originally was named after John Breckenridge of Kentucky. But the miners, including Alonzo Ickes, one of the guys in my book, who were there when the South seceded, got so mad that they changed the spelling of the name of the town so that it wouldn't be named after him anymore, and it would be its own original name. So that's another piece of trivia for you, how the town of Breckenridge, Colorado got its name. Sibley also thought that the 50,000 Hispano civilians of New Mexico territory would come with the Confederates. Kind of a reasonable ask, perhaps, because they had been fighting the U.S. a little more than 10 years before, right? They hadn't been citizens of the United States for very long. The legislature in New Mexico territory was still all Hispano Ricos who had a lot of power and were invested in kind of the future of New Mexico territory and may have seen the Confederacy as, a viable future. However, Sibley was not a student of history, and he sort of forgot that in 1841, Texas marched an army to Santa Fe and tried to take it for the Republic of Texas. And New Mexicans had not forgotten that. So when they heard that an army of Texans was coming, there is no way they were going to join that fight. So that alliance, gone. Sibley also thought Mormons in Utah might come along because they too had recently fought a battle with U.S. Forces in 1857-58. So, only a couple of years before, and they might have a bone to pick. And this was where, Lincoln didn't do a lot of courting of indigenous peoples or other potential Confederates in the West, but he did chat with an emissary from Utah, and he gave him this very Lincoln-esque message for Brigham Young, because of course it's Lincoln, so he starts with a little story. So he's like, you know what, when I was out on the farm, when we were plowing the field, and we came up on a really big tree that had fallen, and it was waterlogged and it was heavy, and we just couldn't drag it off. We just plowed around it. So you tell Brigham Young that if he stays out of my business, I'll stay out of his business. So he plowed around him, right? So Brigham Young just was like, okay. And he just held off. And he had about 2,000 men, very well-trained men in the Mormon militia who could have helped either side actually quite efficiently, but they stayed out of it. And Sibley also thought maybe that indigenous peoples would come along all throughout the Southwest, would come along with the Confederacy, because again, they had been fighting U.S. Army forces since the 1840s, since Americans first appeared in their homelands. They had been fighting the Spanish and the Mexicans for longer than that. So he thought, yeah, okay, we could maybe make some alliances. That did not happen. For indigenous peoples in the region, and I talk a lot about this in the book, this white man's war was like a beautiful present because there were thousands of people on the roads of the West where there had not been before. And they all had horses and mules and wagons and cattle herds, perfect for raiding. And the Southwest was a raiding economy. And so this was a field day for them. They took no side in the U.S. Confederate conflict. They raided both sides equally. So, phase 2, Sibley finally gets his brigade, 3,000 Texans, to El Paso in time for Christmas, 1861, but they are exhausted. They had been marching through West Texas in the winter. They got hit by a bunch of blue northern storms, which had never been out there, you know, are extremely unpleasant, very sleety. And their horses were exhausted, their mules were exhausted, and they had to like kind of chill out in Mesilla for about a month. Well, that gave the Union commander all the time in the world to bring in all of his guys. So he had men at Fort Craig, which you can see here, it's a little bit south, about 2 miles south of this star here for the Battle of Valverde. And I'm not going to go into like the details of these battles, but I will just say quickly, the Confederates looked like they were going to win the day, right? The whole shebang. They marched up the Rio Grande. They thought about attacking Fort Craig, but it's really hard to actually attack a fort when you have equal numbers. That's not a good idea in most cases. So they went around. They ended up fighting just 2 miles north at a crossing on the Rio Grande called Valverde. The Confederates won that fight. It was just a one-day battle. They kept moving. They went north. They took Albuquerque. Then they took Santa Fe. One of the only times the Confederate Army has taken the capital of, or took a capital of a U.S. state or territory during the American Civil War. And the Confederates did it at this point. Now the problem was, because they had bypassed Fort Craig, they didn't get the supplies they needed. And remember, when I told you Sibley's plan was they were going to subsist themselves on the road, right? But the Hispano civilians were not helping them. They were hiding all of their food. And I don't know if you've ever tried to ride a horse through the New Mexico desert without food, where water supplies are pretty far between. It's not great. So this is one of the other things we learn in this theater, is the vital importance, not only of logistics in a campaign like this, but also the vital importance of natural resources, particularly water. Who has access to it? How can they get it? Because without it, the campaign's not going to go on, right? So they keep marching north, and they decide they're going to go get Fort Union, which is in northeastern New Mexico territory. They run into a 2,000-man army of Colorado miners at Apache Canyon and then Glorieta Pass. The Confederates, I mean, the Apache Pass is kind of a draw, or Apache Canyon is a draw. Glorieta Pass, the Confederates actually do win on the battlefield. However, as you all likely know, John Slew, who is the commander of those Pikes Peakers, not a military man, but he's a lawyer. I imagine there are some lawyers in this room, former lawyers. So, you know, big readers. So as he was preparing to take command of the 1st Colorado, John Slew read military manuals. And he was like, oh, this flanking maneuver seems kind of interesting. The Confederates are all strung out along the Santa Fe Trail. Maybe we can get some guys behind him, which they did successfully with a group of about 400 men led by Hispano scouts and soldiers. They got behind them and they burned their entire 80-wagon wagon train. Now again, as I just kind of told you, logistics are the key to a campaign in the Southwest. There was no way the Confederate Army was going to continue on when they did not have their supplies. They barely had enough horses and mules to get out of there. So they retreated to Santa Fe, and then you can see this blue line is the line of their retreat. And you can see they took this kind of big, wide detour. They were trying not to fight ERS Canby's troops along the Rio Grande. And Canby was trying not to fight them because he knew his supply line was just as long as theirs. And he did not want to fight them because then he would have to take them prisoner, and then he would have to feed them. And he didn't want to do that. He didn't have enough food to feed 6,000 men instead of 3,000, right? So he just let them go. This was a disastrous retreat for the Confederates. They started this retreat in April. They got back to San Antonio in July. So imagine if you're on foot, going through southern New Mexico and West Texas in the middle of summer. Not enjoyable. They had 25% casualties on that retreat, which is one of the highest in the Civil War. So even though, these are very small numbers of soldiers engaged, they're huge numbers for the region, and their casualty rates were as high as the highest casualty rates in the Trans-Mississippi West and in the Eastern Theater. So at this point, the U.S. Confederate fight is pretty much over. They're always, John Baylor kind of went back, ended up getting elected to the Confederate Congress, kept trying to get another invasion going, and it just never worked. So basically, the U.S. had mostly control over the West by the summer of 1862, really by the spring of 1862, and this is 40% of the nation's landmass. Most importantly, though, they had kept the Confederates from getting that gold and getting that access to Pacific ports. Hugely significant. And U.S. generals didn't have to then send more men. They probably would have gone from the Trans-Mississippi and been transferred to try and help, because the battle effectively was over. So this had really deleterious effects on the Confederate economy, because they kept having to pay for the war effort by taxing their own people, desperately trying to get enough money. Again, it kind of weakened the Confederacy militarily because of that. Also, the Confederates tried to get Mexico to come in on their side, and they're like, well, if we can march all the way to California, will you recognize us? And the northern governors of Sonora and Chihuahua were like, maybe. And then they're like, no, when they went back. So Mexico remains sort of neutral, although they do keep the Confederacy supplied with cattle via Texas. But politically, this was super interesting, because what this meant is that Lincoln was able to send his Republican civil officials throughout the West and be assured that they would have control of these western states and territories that came into the United States, really right on the eve of the war. Also, interestingly, it allowed the U.S. Congress to pass two really important pieces of legislation that are Civil War pieces of legislation, which everyone forgets. The Homestead Act, which is passed in the spring of 1862 after Congress hears that the Confederates have gone back to where they came from, and the Pacific Railway Act, which launches the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. So these two pieces of legislation, hugely significant for Western history, as you all well know, and they only happen because U.S. forces are able to retain control of the West during this campaign. But there are two more phases yet to come. This one you probably know the most about, given where we are. The California Column, its creation and their march from Los Angeles and Fort Tejon to the Rio Grande in the spring and summer of 1862. So these forces were under the command of James Henry Carleton, another career military guy who, unlike Henry Sibley, was very good at paperwork. He was super type A, to the point of being really annoying. And he recruited and trained a bunch of miners from Southern California and various other people who were living here, and was ready to hit the road in December of 1861 and march basically what is the route of Interstate 10 all the way to New Mexico territory, which would have put them in the general area. The plan was for them to come in the south. Sibley was going to be stuck in between Carleton's U.S. forces and Canby's U.S. forces, and they were just going to crunch them. But then something happened. Again, something with which you are very familiar, which was an atmospheric river. And for 6 weeks it rains in Southern California. People were boating through the streets of Los Angeles. And the roads over into the mountains were impassable. Until the spring, until the roads dried out. So basically, Sibley was already on his way back. He was in retreat when Carleton's guys finally left Los Angeles, right? when they finally left and started on this crazy march. I was going to call this book, like, Long Marches, because this was another 700-mile march through the northern reaches of the Sonoran and the Chihuahuan deserts. Now again, Carleton, much better at this than Sibley. He marched his guys at night. He staggered them. He broke them up into groups to manage water supplies. He sent guys ahead to clean out wells and let them in springs kind of refill naturally before the next group would get there. He had sent groups ahead before the atmospheric river started to cache supplies. That was huge. And he did not, quite famously, he did not lose a man to injury or disease on this march. He lost a couple guys at Picacho Pass, because there were some Confederates there who'd been sent west as sort of scouts. And they had a little skirmish, and he lost, like I think 2 or 3 men there. But that was it. He did not lose men by any other fashion on this march. Really kind of remarkable. He retook the town of Tucson, which the Confederates had control of initially. And then he ran into, and this is very important, he ran into the Chiricahua Apache at Apache Pass, east of Tucson. They had a battle. The U.S. forces won that battle. They took control of the water source there, a spring that was the only water source within 60 miles. This was an advance group. When Carleton came through Apache Pass a couple weeks later, he had, before this point, had a pretty flexible notion of how he was going to deal with indigenous peoples along the route. He had already kind of made some alliances with some of them along the way to be kind of their quartermasters, the Army's quartermasters. But when he saw the graves of his men at Apache Pass, he was done. And again, this was Carleton's whole kind of personality. He was very strict. Once he decided on something, he was super stubborn. He was never going to change his mind, right? So, he gets to the Rio Grande in August of 1862, way too late to do anything about Sibley. His men are itching for a fight. They really want to be part of this war effort. Carleton takes over the Department of New Mexico Territory from ERS Canby, who then goes east, and then he starts his own plan. He's got roughly 3,000 soldiers. He's got 2,000 of his own California column guys, and then he's got about 1,000 1st New Mexico soldiers under Kit Carson. And he and Kit Carson actually knew each other. Again, Carleton had been a career military guy, so he had been posted in Albuquerque, and he'd gotten to know Kit Carson, and just sort of loved him. Just thought he was the best. It was a little kind of bromance brewing on his side. I don't think on Kit Carson's side. But he was delighted to see him again. And he decided that he was going to use these soldiers under Carson, and then his own guys under his favorite officer, Joseph Rodman West, and that he was going to turn them, not against Confederates, but against indigenous peoples. So this is the 4th phase of the war in this theater. U.S. soldiers who had mustered into the American Army for the Civil War were involved in this fight. They saw it as kind of part and parcel of the war itself. This is where the term the three-cornered war comes from. It comes from a California column soldier who said, out here, this is a three-cornered war. We're fighting Confederates and we're fighting Indians, right? And they're both fighting for the United States to have control of this territory. So Carleton sends Kit Carson first after the Mescalero Apache and then after the Navajo peoples between 1862 and 1864. He has chosen the site of a reservation called Bosque Redondo, which is on the Pecos River in central New Mexico territory. And he thought, this is what we're going to do. We are going to force these indigenous peoples into battle. We're going to force them to surrender, and then we're going to move them to these reservations. Now, part of the reason for this was, trying to get his men in action. Part of the reason for this was to Again, further secure the West for the United States. The other reason is that there had been a gold strike in Arizona. And both of the paths to that gold strike, which is around Prescott, were through Apache country, Chiricahua Apache country, and also through the homelands of the Navajo people. So he sent Carson, again, on the kind of northern side, he sent west after the Chiricahua Apache and Mangus Coloradus. They killed Mangus Coloradus in January 1863, took him prisoner during a kind of fake parley, and then the official report says he tried to escape, but most accounts agree that the soldiers tortured him and then killed him for no reason. They thought, and Joseph Rodman West thought, oh, like you take away the Chiricahua Apache's commander and the army will fall apart. Oh no, right? They got even angrier. And this is the beginning of the Apache Wars in the Southwest, led by Geronimo and Cochise. Cochise was Mangus Coloradus' son-in-law, and Geronimo was the leader of another band of Apache people. So this starts this just incredible sort of conflagration in the Southwest, and they do not go to Bosque Redondo. Kit Carson, though, was more successful against the Navajo in their homelands, and ultimately 10,000 of them surrendered and were forced on a 400-mile walk to Bosque Redondo and forced to stay on this reservation that was very far away from any kind of landscape that they had known. So Carleton, in the middle of the Civil War, is basically creating a new U.S. Indian policy. Up to this point, there was treaty making in the beginning, and then both sides would break the treaty, and there would be continued kind of raiding and scuffling. Carleton said, forget treaties. First step will be war, again, second step will be forced surrender, and then removal to reservations. And this, in fact, became the U.S. policy after the Civil War. So one of the figures in the book, who is a little bit unexpected, he was a late-breaking protagonist. There are 7 of them. No, they're not. There are 9. I don't know why I'm losing count. There are 9 of them. There could have been 20, but there are 9 of them. He was a sort of late-breaking addition to the book because, I mean, he's the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory. I didn't really know much about him. My agent was like, is there any way you can get Lincoln into this book? And I was like, no, he wasn't there. This is going to be a book that is very close to the ground. It's following people through the Southwest, right? This is my strategy in the book. If you've read it, you already know that. If you've not read it, spoiler alert, this is not like a kind of regular academic Civil War book. It's structured a little bit more like a novel. It interweaves the experiences of these 9 different people in the West during this period, and one of them is John Clark. And the reason that I became interested in him is that I was at the Chavez Library at the Museum of New Mexico, and I was kind of looking at all of their Civil War records. And the archivist was like, oh, are you interested in seeing the John Clark diaries? And I was like, sure, let's see them. There are 25 diaries. His handwriting was pretty beautiful. He was a surveyor, but there was also a typescript, 350 pages long. He was in New Mexico Territory, had been appointed as the Surveyor General by Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. Was a diehard Republican, knew Lincoln, was friends with him, went back to D.C. and sort of talked to him, talked to the Department of War about what was going on in New Mexico. So I was like, okay, here's my link. Here's the guy I can use to talk about Republican policies, right, in the Southwest. Plus, he has all these amazing diaries. He wrote every day about all kinds of things. He wrote about the weather. He wrote about learning Spanish. He wrote about doing all of these plat maps. He wrote about going to seances with Louisa Canby, who is another one of my protagonists in the book. So I was like, this is amazing. And he wrote every week to the General Land Office. So I was like, well, I wonder where those letters are. Well, they're at the National Archives. So I went there, and here's a photograph of the box of letters that Clark wrote during the war itself, and I am convinced that I was the third person to see these letters. Clark was the first because he wrote them. Actually, no, I was the fourth. The second person was the clerk who opened them. The third was the archivist who filed them, and then it was me. Because look at the piece on top is a plat map he made of Santa Fe. And look at those creases.
Yeah.
They're insane. And look at the, like this is a 150-year-old document. And it is pristine. Just amazing. And so here is this box, this acid-free box, just stuffed with every single letter that Clark wrote. And so I have him in his diary saying, wrote letter to the General Land Office. And I was like, oh, here's the letter. And here's what he's saying, here's his report from New Mexico, talking about the gold strike, which he confirmed and spread news of in the East, about he was the one who surveyed Bosque Redondo for the reservation. So he was involved in everything. He knew everybody. He knew Louisa Canby, Kit Carson, Carlton. He knew all, like, multiple other figures in the book. And this is one of those things, I'm sure you guys have run into this, where you realize that two people who you didn't think had anything to do with each other actually met or crossed paths or did something together. This happens a lot in the kind of pre-Civil War and Civil War West. A lot of people crossing paths. So he became this like really great protagonist for me. But he was the one who surveyed Bosque Redondo, and he didn't kind of weigh in on whether this was a good idea to put it people who usually ranged across, millions of acres on a 40 square mile plot of land, by a river that was largely alkaline and flooded all the time and destroyed irrigation ditches. Bosque Redondo was a disaster from the start, and this is where Carlton's kind of logistics really failed. He thought that there would be fewer people. He had found Bosque Redondo and thought it was perfect and would not budge even when his officers were like, you know what, this isn't great. Like, there aren't a lot of trees for them to build shelter. The water isn't great. There's nothing to hunt. The soil is not great for agriculture. But Carlton wouldn't listen. The Navajo people had a 25% casualty rate at Bosque Redondo. And I think that we can look at this reservation site, and he thought of them as his prisoners of war. And Indian Affairs was actually under the Department of War during this period, not the Department of the Interior, right? And this is a photograph from the period that shows you the kind of structures they were living in. Because again, they didn't have trees. So they were literally building mud huts in a landscape that was not their own. They had no familiarity with, really at all. So the Navajo people called Bosque Redondo Waildi, or land of suffering. And this period of 4 years that they were there from 64, that probably 80% of the Navajo people were there, from 1868 when they negotiated their own return to their homelands. This is a major point, a major kind of watershed moment in Navajo history, as well as the history of the West and the history of the Civil War. And to tell that story, I chose Juanita, who's a Navajo civilian. She was married to Manuelito, who was one of the headmen of the Navajo people, who had been fighting the U.S. Army since the 1840s and had successfully evaded them from 1864 to 1866. And initially I was trying to decide whether Manuelito was going to be one of the major figures or whether it was going to be Juanita, and then I thought, well, you know what, I know where she is. Because the U.S. Army is super concerned about Manuelito. So they're always trying to get him, and they're sending emissaries out, they're getting reports about where he is, and she is where he is, right? So I know where she is. She also gave me the opportunity to talk about civilians in the war in a way that we haven't really thought about them before. And she also, this is a photograph from her visit with a Navajo delegation to negotiate with Ulysses S. Grant in 1874. She is wearing a dress of her own design and weaving, and she is surrounded, we think, by blankets of her own design, although we're not really sure. Because one of the really super interesting things about Juanita is that her Navajo name meant Lady Weaver. She was a master weaver, and she allowed me to really talk about something, again, that we don't talk about a whole lot in Civil War history, which is textiles and material culture, right? And the fascinating thing that I learned, I'd never really talked about any of this at all before this point, but before the Civil War, this weaving, especially of blankets, but also of clothing, of saddle blankets, of other kinds of items that were useful to the Navajo, this was a huge part of both Navajo culture and the community, and it was run entirely by women. Women herded the sheep, they sheared them, they spun the wool, and they dyed it with plants and dyes that they collected from the landscape, and then they wove the pieces. And these items were totally just coveted in the southwestern trade. They were really woven very tightly so that they were pretty much waterproof, and you could get a lot in return for these. So women are contributing in this major way to Navajo culture and society. At Bosque Redondo, they were not allowed to take their sheep. They did not have the same kind of plants for dyeing. And they had some looms, but they had to build them really themselves. Carleton, when he saw how kind of desperate they were to continue this work, ordered some sheep, but then ordered huge amounts of yarn from Germantown, Pennsylvania. And so what you see is this very striking split during the Bosque period. You have a pre-rust Bosque Redondo textile style, which you can see here on the left. And then you have the Bosque Redondo and post-Bosque Redondo style, which are called Germantown eye dazzlers. Because they're made with Germantown wool that has been dyed in all sorts of colors that are not available in the nature of New Mexico territory, right? They also include different shapes and styles that are reflecting the changes going on at Bosque Redondo. But talking about Juanita really allowed me to talk about this production, and as a kind of new and different way to talk about the Navajo experience, the critical role that women played and civilians played in the Civil War, and in reservation life. And Juanita, I really think, she and John Clark are the only protagonists in the book, and the other protagonists include John Baylor and James Carleton and Kit Carson, Louisa Cambion, a Texan soldier named Jim Davidson, and then a Union soldier named Alonzo Ickes. And she's the only one they are both the only ones who are in New Mexico territory from 61 to 68, the whole duration of the book. And she is the only one who stays, right? That is persistence personified. And so she really is, I think, the heart of the book in many ways. So what do we learn when we see the Civil War from this far Western, real Western theater? Well, as I noted before, you see the importance of logistics. I think we talk a lot about battles, right? But battles were only 5% of the soldiers' experience. The rest of it was marching and camping. And how do you move thousands of people across a landscape, right? How do you keep them alive? How do you keep them fed? And how do you keep them in fighting shape? This is a huge challenge. And so the armies that had really great logistics are the ones that win the campaigns, right? We also see the effect of long distances. This is a very unique theater in that respect. We are often, when we're talking about Virginia, they're fighting over 100 miles. And think about the long marches in this theater where they are going from waterhole to waterhole, 50 miles away. The natural resources, especially water, are driving decision-making in this theater. And then also, the long distances also contributes to this feature of the Far Western Theater, which I talked about before with Baylor, and then also to some extent with Carleton, because he was doing all of that. He was launching Indian campaigns and creating Bosque Redondo, again, totally on his own, and just reporting back to the U.S. Department of War. And then we also see the importance of hard war, of including civilians in wartime action. And many of the campaigns during this period had that component, particularly that phase 4, where Carleton is going after indigenous peoples. And then ultimately it shows us the importance of controlling the West during the Civil War. We're so often talking about, well, the wars between the North and the South. And that is true, but it's also about and in the West. And it's important to know, too, that in the Far West, the Civil War is simultaneously an Indian War. And that indigenous peoples were engaged with both U.S. and Confederate troops in that first phase, and then fully engaged with U.S. troops in that fourth phase. So really, ultimately, the three-cornered war, the Civil War in the American West shows us that the war is a continental conflict, that it involves everyone, and that from this viewpoint, here in the West, we shouldn't think that the Civil War history doesn't belong to us in California, right? California was involved. The West was involved. And so the Civil War was something that everyone experienced from coast to coast. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, Michelle.
Well, I was going to ask you about these two acts of Congress during the Civil War. You said that they were able to pass them because the Confederacy failed in the West. Wasn't another factor that there were no Confederates in Congress to vote against that having a more northern route for the railway?
Yeah, so Michelle's question is about the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act, that they were able to pass those not only because the U.S. Army gained control of the West, but also because the Confederates were all gone. They had all seceded. And that's absolutely correct. Like they had been, the fights over this it was so obstructionist in Congress, they could not pass any of these throughout the 1850s, right? But then all of the Confederate senators and representatives, they secede. The Republicans have this huge majority. There's some Democrats, from New York and Pennsylvania floating around, and some kind of dicey characters from California, to be honest. But, who are kind of pushing back a little bit, but they have such a huge majority that they can pass anything they want. But they wait until they know they have control of the West. And so they pass the Homestead Act in May, they pass the Pacific Railway Act in June, after they have heard that the Confederates are gone. Because they're not going to pass an act if the Texans are holding Denver, what's the point, right? Or Los Angeles or San Bernardino. You're absolutely right. It was both of those things together. They had all the power, and then they had the opportunity, and they finally got it done. Yes, sir?
When a general wrote a letter to Washington, did they keep a carbon copy of themselves? Is that what you have in those files?
So the question is, when an officer wrote a letter to back east, did they keep a copy? Often they did. Either a clerk would keep a copy, would actually write out a different copy of it, and so that was super helpful. The clerk didn't have any copies, so all those letters went to DC and they stayed in DC. So I could only access them there. But most of the commanders in this theater did have assistants, and they did have clerks, and they were creating multiple copies. And Kit Carson, who was not literate, had people on his staff writing his for him as he dictated them, and then they would also read anything to him that was incoming. And some of those, one of the other things to note about this theater that's sort of interesting from a historian's perspective is that, you know, we're used to when we do Civil War history, you just have like millions of records at your disposal, right? There are Civil War records everywhere. The Huntington has just like a huge cache, including the very charming letters of a soldier who includes how thrilled he was to be eating donuts. Like at a certain point, and he's so excited, like the donut is like this big font. And I get it. Donuts are delicious. But you know, they're all over the place. There are Civil War documents everywhere, but mostly from the Trans-Mississippi West and the East, right? There were so few men engaged. Many of them were miners who were not, they just didn't write letters from the diggings either. They weren't writing a lot, and they weren't often writing diaries. And so there's just way fewer. Plus, the burning of the wagon trains at Glorieta Pass destroyed Confederate letters and diaries that had been reporting on the first phase of that campaign. Including in the book I have lots of quotes from Alfred Petticolas, I'm probably pronouncing his name horribly, but he wrote diary entries and he sketched in his diary. But his diary of everything up to Glorieta Pass was lost. So we only have his retreat diary. There were no photographers in this region, so I think we have like one image in 1864 of Carleton's headquarters, and that's it. And you know, that's really it. So you are not dealing with a lot of stuff, but the officers pretty reliably on both sides were writing at least reports, just saying, hey, this is what I did. and then of course there were several instances of people getting court-martialed, and that produced a lot of records after the fact. Yes, ma'am.
What about Clark's letters? Are they being actually archived so that you can access them online, or?
The question is about whether John Clark's letters are digitized. They are not. And at the moment, you know, I don't know how many staff the National Archives has lost currently, but they won't be digitized anytime soon, unfortunately. And his diaries are also not digitized, but they are transcribed. This was, by the way, the most expensive thing that I usually, you know, I buy a lot of books. Sometimes those books are used, or I have a hard time like tracking them down. I have to buy them from various collectors. But the photocopy of the transcript of Clark's diaries, which was 350 pages, cost me $350. So that was a very expensive book that I bought, but it was totally worth it because it was amazing. But I'm glad I looked at the originals because he also had sketches. Like he drew this tiny, when he was on his way to the Arizona gold mines, he drew this, he went through some of the pueblos on the way, and he drew this tiny little figure of a Pueblo woman at a loom, weaving. And then he did maps, he did kind of landscape figures, and he had little things tucked in there too, like little drafts of speeches he was going to make at these gatherings in Santa Fe, kind of toasts to Carleton and to Carson and the others, you know. So there are some things that did not get transcribed. So you should always look at the originals if you can, because they have all those other little cool elements to them. But no plans for digitization yet, I don't think. But they'd really have to flatten those babies out because,
Saw the fold.
oh yeah, the creases are intense. Yes, ma'am.
What did they want the gold for, or was it just for money? Was it, and if so, where did they sell the gold?
This is a
And the
question.
silver too, I imagine they also mined with that.
Yeah, exactly. The gold, so this is a question about like what were they using gold for? Both the U.S. and the Confederacy were using gold as currency, as various forms of currency, but they were also using gold to back money. So that's how you created stable currency, was to have enough gold that you could kind of stabilize the value of it, Also, starting in about 1862, the US started selling war bonds that were payable in gold. And so this is actually how the book after this is called Saving Yellowstone, and Jay Cook is one of the major figures there, and he made a fortune in the Civil War selling war bonds because he took a percentage of that. So like, you'd come with $50, you'd buy your war bond, and the promise was, you'd get it, you could come back and cash it in for a particular interest rate. I think it was like 3%, but you would get it in gold. So they needed that gold to be able to make good on that promise, and the Confederacy wanted that. They did sell war bonds for a time, but as we know, that didn't go well for them, and they were worthless in the end. Yeah. Yes, ma'am?
This is probably another entire book, but I'm wondering now how the Civil War in the East affected the indigenous people there.
That is an excellent question. How did the Civil War in the East affect indigenous peoples, kind of east of the Mississippi River, probably, or east even of the Rockies?
Yes.
20,000 indigenous men served as soldiers in the American Civil War, on both sides, which is really, really fascinating. Many of them in Indian Territory, because the five civilized tribes, the Seminole, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Cherokee, thank you. They were divided populations. They were sort of like their own border state because they were slave owning. They were African slave owning. And so many of them went with the Confederacy, including Stanwaty, who was one of the last Confederate generals to surrender. And they engaged in several major battles in the Trans-Mississippi West. There were also indigenous soldiers who fought for the US and the Confederacy in the East, because they had reservations already kind of established in the Carolinas, and then also in Pennsylvania, and then the Midwest as well. I would say, there was that component of it, where indigenous peoples were actually directly engaging in warfare. Probably the heaviest toll that the war took was in Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, because that was an active battleground. And it involved so many indigenous soldiers and civilians, and they were often refugees in the wake of those fights. But really the effect nationwide really hinges on that Homestead Act and Pacific Railway Act, because those were pieces of legislation that promoted white settlement of the West. And that brought the U.S. Army kind of seamlessly moves from Civil War actions like Carleton's into what we kind of know of as the Indian Wars of the 1870s and 80s, which pushes most indigenous peoples onto reservations and then takes their land through allotment and sells it to white settlers. So the Civil War is kind of clearing the way for that as an engagement. Janet?
Where did you get the beautiful photographs that you used in your
I
presentation?
took them myself. Yes, I am a cultural historian, also an environmental historian, and I believe fervently in the power of seeing the places that you're writing about. Not necessarily because they're kind of hallowed ground, but because they really help you see what happened and why it happened. Like, for example, when John Baylor was chasing those Federals, he was chasing them here through this image that you're seeing here, the Jornada del Muerto, which is, the journey or the path of the dead man, or dead man's journey. This is a stretch of desert in New Mexico along the Rio Grande that has no water, in a kind of 40-mile by 20-mile stretch. And there was a road that went from Fort Fillmore over the Oregon Mountains into a basin that you might be familiar with if you've been to White Sands National Park, now National Park, was National Park. And then the road kind of went north to another U.S. fort, Fort Stanton. And that's where those Federals were trying to go. They were trying to go to Fort Stanton and escape over the Oregon Mountains. And what I didn't know, if you look at this photograph, right, you're looking at it, first of all, people are always surprised. People who are not from the West are very surprised when they see this photograph, because they're like, that's a desert? And you're like, oh yes. Yes, and they think it's just sand, right? The high desert is just sand. But this is at about 3,000 feet of elevation here. This is the Jornada del Muerto kind of, it's looking west, but it's between the Rio Grande and the Oregon Mountains. And so the Federals were crossing this on a sandy road. All of their water supplies were in wagons at the back of the train. The soldiers, when they had abandoned the fort, had a little taste of the whiskey that had been stored there that they were leaving behind. So they were dehydrated anyway, and it was July in New Mexico, southern New Mexico. So it was 95 degrees by like 10 in the morning. And what I didn't know until I went there is that this area and the path they were moving on was at a 1% grade, which when I did this research trip, it was 2014, and I took my stick shift car and my bike. And so I biked in this direction, and when you do, and if you drive a stick shift, you know when there's a grade. Your car starts rolling backwards. And so the 1% grade is called the grade of deception. Because you think it's flat, but it's not. So they were moving across 15 miles of a steady uphill grade. So they were gaining elevation the entire time. The water wagons were dragging behind. They were super dehydrated. Their bodies were working harder. And the sun is beating down on them. Even the guys on horseback were having problems. Their horses were just like, forget it, I'm not moving on. And then they hit the Oregon Mountains, and they had to go up over a pass up a nearly 7% grade, which is called the grade of difficulty. And if you've ever been on a bike trying to go up a 7% grade, that's like a small wheel situation. You have to like get on a really like fit to just kind of try to spin up it, because it's really hard. So they really slowed down over the last 2 miles, and that's when Baylor caught up with them. But I wouldn't have known that just from looking at the map or reading the reports, because Baylor's just like, I rode after them and caught up with them, because I'm awesome, you know? So like, so that was it. But so I went to all of the places that you see, and including the Museum or Navajo Nation Museum in Window Rock, which is an amazing museum. Fort Union in New Mexico, which still has like ruins from the period, adobe ruins kind of sitting out there on the prairie on the Santa Fe Trail. It's a very cool spot. It's a national historical monument if you want to go. The only place I didn't get to go, so this is Apache Pass. Again, it doesn't look like you think, right? You think like, oh, it's a pass through the mountains, right? But so you're maybe thinking of something quite different. But this was a very long road up into this open space, but it had hills all around, and the Chiricahua Apache could just watch you coming for miles. And then the Canyon de Chelly in Navajo Nation, which is the site of one of, Kit Carson basically marched an army through the bottom of this canyon in the middle of winter, and had fought in a hard war against Navajo peoples before that, so they were on the brink of starvation. But yeah, so being there kind of gives me this very good sense of how people are interacting with the landscape in this context and in this moment. And I think, this is one of the things that only has recently become a field in Civil War history, environmental studies. And kind of really looking, we can all say, well, yes, the war was fought outside. Yes, we know this. But how are the different kind of theaters, and how are how does it affect a soldier's body to march from Albuquerque to Santa Fe, which is going from 3,000 feet of elevation to 7,500 feet of elevation? How does that, do the miners have an advantage because they're coming down from a place like Breckenridge at 10,000 feet? I mean, when you're talking,
they definitely had an advantage.
Oh, yes.
That's
And
why
they-
they want them, because they were used to it. And if you look at that, the way that landscape is,
Mhm.
they were up.
Yeah.
They could see you coming forever,
Exactly.
you know, and
Yeah.
they were just going along there and thinking, oh, yeah, big deal, but they were there.
Oh, yeah, and they have a huge advantage, and you always see in soldiers' accounts, when they write about particularly the Navajo coming to raid them in the middle of the night, they're just like, they're sending people after them, and it's just useless. It's useless. Like, they have no idea what they're doing, they haven't been here before, they don't know the landscape. And, you know, Indigenous raiders are like, we have the upper hand in every single possible way in this landscape. But they didn't have the numbers. And they also didn't have cannon, which they had guns, but they did not have cannon. And that was a major, major factor.
I think this gentleman had one more question. We want to give you enough time to sign your books.
Okay, the final question, you have the last question,
I was
sir.
going to ask about Canby. Was he the same general that got killed in the Modoc Indian Wars?
Yes, he was.
Oh,
Yes. So Canby was another kind of professional military guy, West Point guy, and he was everywhere. He fought in Florida, he fought in the Mexican-American War, he was in Monterey in 1850, and he and Louisa Canby actually wrote out the Constitution, like, when they debated the Constitution of California, she wrote one of the copies. And then they went from there, they were in the Utah War against the Mormons, and then they went to Santa Fe. And they were there for about a year and a half, and then he was sent to the DC, and then he was at Mobile Bay, and then he continued to serve after the war, yes, and ended up killed by the Modoc in 1873. Yep,
thank you.
yes. All right, I think I'm sorry.
Excellent.